December 5th, 1943. The air in Boston Harbor cut like shards of ice, yet warmth flowed from the kitchens of Fort Deans, Massachusetts, where the first group of German women prisoners of war were being processed. Wrapped in threadbare wool coats, they shuffled down the gangplank of a Liberty ship that had carried them across an Atlantic storm, their eyes darting nervously at the sight of uniformed American MPs and rows of trucks waiting at the pier. For years, they had been fed stories by Nazi propaganda. America was collapsing, its citizens starving, its women destitute. Yet within the first hours on American soil, those carefully crafted illusions shattered in the most unexpected way. Not through speeches, not through statistics, but through the simple experience of breakfast. One prisoner later wrote in her diary, "We thought the Americans were mocking us. Scrambled eggs in shining bowls, butter in thick slabs, bread so white it looked artificial. We stared, waiting for the trick, waiting for someone to pull it away, but no one did. They told us toot as much as we wished, and we wept." What followed in the coming months would become one of the most remarkable and least told stories of the war. How young women raised under the shadow of Hitler's Reich discovered in captivity not humiliation, but dignity, and how their first taste of scrambled eggs became the beginning of a transformation so profound that many begged not to return to Germany at war's end. The Liberty ship rolled and groaned against the winter Atlantic swells, its steel hull shuddering with every wave. The German women huddled below deck wrapped in coats that had long since lost their warmth, listening to the steady thrum of the engines and the distant voices of American sailors. They had been told to expect cruelty, starvation, and humiliation. Many whispered that their journey would end in camps no better than slave pens, a fitting punishment for prisoners of war. Yet, from the first day aboard, something unsettled their expectations. Each was given a medical inspection, their wounds treated without contempt, and blankets handed out that were thick, clean, and sufficient for the bitter cold. The meals astonished them most of all. White bread, a luxury none had seen in years, was served in slices as though it were common fare. Coffee, black and rich, appeared each morning instead of the thin, bitter substitute brewed from roasted barley back home. The women eyed the meals suspiciously, some refusing at first to touch them, convinced it was part of some elaborate charade. But when the food kept coming, regular, generous, and unaccompanied by jeers or beatings, they began to question quietly what sort of enemy this was. After nearly 2 weeks, Boston Harbor came into view. The women pressed against the rails, breath frosting, in the sharp December air, staring at a shoreline ablaze with lights. Neon signs flickered over warehouses. Street lamps lined the docks in unbroken rows, and the silhouettes of trucks and cranes moved in constant rhythm. To women raised in a Reich, where entire cities lay in darkness by order of blackout regulations, the sight was beyond comprehension. One whispered to another that it must be for their benefit, staged illumination to impress prisoners. Yet the activity looked too casual, too natural. Dock workers carried on with their duties without a glance toward the ship, as if such abundance of power and light was simply normal. Expecting cattle cars, the prisoners braced themselves as they disembarked. Instead, heated trucks waited in neat rows, their engines humming in the frozen air. They climbed inside, finding cushioned benches instead of wooden slats. As the convoy pulled away from the docks, they passed through streets lined with shops, still open in the evening, their windows glowing with goods unimaginable in war-starved Germany. They caught glimpses of department store displays, diners with neon menus, even families walking casually along the sidewalks with bags in their hands. The prisoners stared in stunned silence. America, which Nazi broadcasts had insisted was collapsing into poverty and chaos, revealed itself as a land of abundance even in wartime. The trucks arrived at Fort Deans, a sprawling complex lit as bright as midday, despite the winter night. The women were led into processing halls where American officers and clerks greeted them not with barks or blows, but with quiet efficiency. Each prisoner was photographed, issued an identification card, and spoken to in her own language by fluent translators. They were not stripped, beaten, or mocked. Their belongings were recorded and stored carefully. For women who had seen how Germany treated its captives, forced marches, insults, and deprivation, this almost bureaucratic civility was bewildering. Some muttered that the Americans were soft, that such kindness would not last. Others felt a flicker of unease deep in their stomachs, a suspicion that perhaps their entire understanding of the enemy had been wrong. It was not until the next morning that the true collapse began. At dawn, the women were marched to the camp cafeteria, bracing themselves for watery soup, crusts of black bread, perhaps turnips if fortune smiled. Instead, thalene stretched before gleaming trays of food, scrambled eggs piled high in steaming bowls, the golden sheen filling the air with smell almost intoxicating after years of scarcity. Strips of bacon sizzled on hot plates. Loaves of white bread were stacked beside slabs of butter, thick enough to smear generously without rationing. Bowls of fruit, apples, oranges, even bananas, stood in bright color against the winter gloom, and coffee, real coffee, poured endlessly into waiting cups. The women hesitated, convinced at first that it was a cruel trick. Some whispered to each other that perhaps the food was not for them, that they would be punished for touching it. But the guards simply nodded, gesturing them forward, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. One prisoner lifted a spoonful of scrambled eggs to her lips and began to cry before swallowing. Another clutched her slice of buttered bread so tightly her fingers left imprints in the soft crust. For women who had subsisted for months on watery turnip stew, beet coffee, and scraps of ersatz margarine, the abundance was unthinkable. Many sat in silence, tears sliding down their cheeks as they ate mouthful after mouthful, their hands trembling as though the food might vanish if they lingered too long. It was not just the taste of eggs, bacon, and coffee that broke them. It was what the meal represented. Back in Germany, propaganda had painted America as weak, decadent, starving under the weight of war. Yet here, in the very first hours of captivity, they were being fed better than German civilians, better even than many German officers. They were enemies, prisoners, women who had served in Hitler's war machine, and yet they were treated with dignity and nourishment that their own nation denied them. Some convinced themselves it must be temporary, a show of wealth designed to demoralize them before rations shrank to the expected level of deprivation. Yet, when the next morning arrived, the eggs returned. The bread was just as white, the butter just as thick, the coffee just as strong. Day after day, the abundance continued until even the most skeptical among them fell silent. Their certainty eroded one bite at a time, their indoctrination crumbling before the undeniable reality of a society that could feed its prisoners like honored guests. The emotional weight of that first meal cannot be overstated. Women who had marched through ruins, who had watched cities burn under Allied bombs, who had believed their homeland unassailable, now sat at long wooden tables in an American camp, weeping into their coffee cups. The scrambled eggs became more than food. They became proof that everything they had been told was a lie. And as the days turned into weeks, the memory of that first breakfast lingered like a revelation. They had stepped off the ship as soldiers of the Reich. They'd sat down to eat as prisoners. But by the end of that first morning, something deeper had begun. They were no longer simply captives of America. They were witnesses to its power, its abundance, and its humanity. The first mornings at Fort Devens became rituals of astonishment. Each day, the German women filed into the cafeteria and received meals that defied every story they had ever been told. The propaganda posters back home had shown Americans queuing for stale bread, mothers clutching thin children while soup kitchens barely ladled watery broth into dented cans. They remembered the radio broadcasts describing riots in American cities, women selling themselves for food, families abandoned in the streets as the government crumbled. It was drilled into them that the United States was decadent, diseased, a country of mongrels and profiteers, destined to collapse under the weight of its own greed. Yet, as they sipped real coffee and spread butter thick across bread so white it looked unreal, they could not reconcile the taste on their tongues with the images burned into their minds. One afternoon, as they marched across the camp to receive uniforms and supplies, they caught sight of Red Cross women entering through the gates. These were not the broken, desperate figures German propaganda had promised. The American women wore wool coats in rich colors, stockings without runs, and their shoes shone with polish. They walked with a confidence that startled the prisoners, their laughter ringing across the yard. A few even carried baskets of small gifts, soap, magazines, candy to distribute among the prisoners. One German nurse whispered to her companion, "They told us American women were no better than prostitutes." She stared at the Red Cross volunteers, who looked like shopkeepers' wives or schoolteachers. "But these look like queens." What unsettled them more than appearances was behavior. Guards read newspapers openly during breaks, folding pages across their knees, not hiding their discontent, but discussing it aloud. One afternoon, a prisoner overheard an American sergeant complain bitterly about President Roosevelt's policies, while another argued back in his defense. The German women froze, convinced such dissent would end in arrest or punishment. But the men laughed, shook their heads, and went on with their duties as though disagreeing with one's leader were the most natural thing in the world. To minds trained under Hitler's Reich, where a careless word could mean denunciation or death, this was incomprehensible. Outside the camp's barbed wire, life bustled with a rhythm entirely at odds with the chaos they had been promised to expect. When trucks carried them past the nearby railway station, they saw civilians streaming home from late shifts. Men and women walked together in groups, their faces bright despite the cold, carrying bags of groceries, chatting freely, unafraid of the soldiers who stood nearby. Parking lots glimmered with rows of cars, ordinary workers' cars, not the rare prize of party elites, but the property of machinists, dock hands, and clerks. One prisoner scribbled in her secret diary. "They told us Americans were divided, that their races fought one another in the streets, that their politicians cheated them, and their women were shameless. Yet here I see them walking together, laughing, unafraid. They feed us better than our own army ever did. What else have we been lied to about?" But disbelief did not dissolve overnight. For every prisoner who marveled, another clung to the certainty that it was all deception. Some whispered in bunks that the meals were staged, that the lights burning late into the night were kept alive only for their eyes, that once their spirits cracked, they would be shoved into darkness and starvation. A few muttered that Americans wanted to soften them, to pry confessions from them through kindness rather than blows. But as the days stretched into weeks, the consistency of life gnawed at those excuses. Every morning brought fresh milk poured freely into pitchers. Every evening ended with electric bulbs still glowing indifferent to blackout orders. Libraries stacked with hundreds of books were opened even to prisoners. Novels and newspapers placed in their hands without restriction. One woman, who had worked as a communications clerk in Hamburg, admitted to her companions that she could no longer believe the radio speeches she had once transcribed. "If this is a lie," she said, holding up a glass of milk, "then it is the most elaborate and enduring deception in history." Her voice trembled, not only with doubt, but with fear. For if America was not starving, not weak, not divided, then what did that mean for Germany's struggle? What did it mean about the very men who had sent them to war? This conflict began to gnaw at them in their sleep. Some woke with nightmares of bombed-out cities back home, only to find themselves in warm barracks with hot water waiting. Shame crept into their voices when they confessed that they felt relief to be here. That captivity offered them more dignity than freedom in Germany had in years. Relief mixed with guilt, and guilt mixed with terror at the realization that they might no longer believe. They had been raised to see doubt itself as treason, yet doubt was now everywhere. In the butter on their bread, in the lights that never dimmed, in the books that dared criticized the very nation that provided them. By the end of that first winter, their inner turmoil had hardened into something impossible to ignore. Each meal confronted them with lies they had once swallowed whole. Each sight of confident American women, of laughing workers, of guards who disagreed openly with their leaders, chipped away at their certainties. They began to sense a quiet fracture inside themselves, a split between what they had been told and what they now lived. For some, it was a liberation. For others, it was terrifying. But for all of them, the realization grew heavier each day. The world they had believed in was an illusion, and the truth was laid bare in every steaming plate of scrambled eggs, every shining electric bulb, every ordinary act of dignity. The days at Fort Devon soon fell into a rhythm that none of the women could have imagined while crossing the Atlantic. At first, they expected deprivation, barracks as bare as barns, thin blankets, and cold floors. Instead, the buildings they entered were lined with steam radiators that hissed warmth into the halls, even as the Massachusetts winter froze the ground outside. Each room contained electric lamps that could be switched on and off at will, a luxury few had known even before the war. The simple act of lying down on bunks with clean sheets, blankets folded at the foot, and radiators glowing softly beside them was enough to make some prisoners weep. 4 years they had lived with fear of bombs, with darkness enforced by blackout curtains, with shortages that turned every night into a fight against cold. Here, behind barbed wire in enemy territory, they discovered more comfort than they had at home. The showers proved even more astonishing. Hot water gushed from steel pipes at any hour of the day, not rationed, not dependent on coal reserves or carefully measured fuel. The first time one of the women stepped beneath the flow, she let out a cry of disbelief, half laughter, half grief. Others lined up again and again simply to feel warmth cascading across skin that had grown used to icy washes in basins, or none at all. In Germany, hot water had become a memory. In captivity, it became routine. To them, it was not simply cleanliness, but a revelation of abundance. Meals arrived with the same clockwork regularity, filling kitchens that seemed closer to modern laboratories than the crude hearth they knew. Refrigerators hummed in the corners, massive mixers spun in bowls as wide as washtubs, ovens baked loaves in endless sequence. For women who had spent hours kneading bread by hand or smoking food to preserve it, the sight of walk-in refrigerators chilled by electricity alone was nearly unbelievable. They could not help but notice the casual way American cooks tossed in ingredients that had become treasures back home. Whole cartons of eggs, slabs of meat, sacks of flour, larger than most German families could ever afford. When the time came for work assignments, another world opened before them. Some were sent Tories, where machines devoured piles of uniforms and linens, turning out fresh, clean loads in minutes. A young prisoner who had worked in Hamburg as a res confessed to being near tears the first time she watched an American washing machine at work. At home, she told a companion, "My mother and I spent hours bent over tubs with soap and boards until our fingers bled. Here it is done in a single cycle while the operator drinks coffee." Others worked in canning plants, where conveyor belts clattered endlessly, glass jars rattling into place, lids sealing with a hiss of steam. One woman calculated that the plant sealed more cans in a single shift than her town's entire cooperative factory had managed in a month. What she had once considered the pinnacle of German efficiency seemed medieval compared to this. Everywhere they looked, the prisoners found their illusions eroding. The Reich had promised them that Germany was the most disciplined, the most organized, the most efficient society in the world. They had been taught that other nations survived only through German superiority, that foreigners were too chaotic or lazy to match German order. Yet here, in the daily routines of kitchens and fields, they watched women in chiefs, immigrant laborers, even black workers operate machines with ease and confidence. The myth of German exclusivity dissolved under the sight of production lines that ran faster, smoother, and at greater scale than anything in the fatherland. The humiliation was sharp. Many of the women felt a sting of shame as they compared their indoctrinated pride with what they now witnessed. But humiliation carried with it a strange new emotion: admiration. They could not deny what stood before their eyes. They marveled at the rhythm of conveyor belts, the efficiency of workers who moved without officers shouting, the abundance that poured from machines without the need for constant sacrifice. It became clear that America's strength did not come from cruelty or fanatic discipline, but from an industrial base so powerful that even its prisoners could live better than civilians in Germany. Most unexpected of all was the dignity. In Germany, discipline was enforced by fear, by shouted commands, by the ever-present threat of punishment. Here, guards spoke to them firmly but without cruelty. Orders were given in plain words, not barks meant to degrade. Medical care was provided when they fell ill. Medicine dispensed as though their lives mattered. Even education was offered. Leaflets invited them to English classes, to lectures on history, to training in agriculture or nutrition. At first, many suspected it was propaganda. Yet, the sincerity of the programs became undeniable. The very normality of life at Fort Deans carried within it a radical lesson. To be treated as a human being, not merely a tool, was possible even in captivity. The shock of this realization crept into the most ordinary moments. A woman, assigned to mop barracks floors, paused to watch a guard bend down and help an elderly prisoner gather books she had dropped. Another time, an American cook, seeing a German nurse struggling with a heavy pot, took it from her hands and carried it himself. No lectures followed, no insinuations of superiority, just a simple gesture of courtesy. These moments pierced deeper than statistics or speeches. They were experiences that revealed a world operating on entirely different principles than the Reich had allowed them to believe existed. As days turned into weeks, the rhythm of captivity no longer felt like punishment, but like an education. They rose to barracks warmed by steam radiators, bathed in showers that flowed endlessly, ate in kitchens that seemed palaces of plenty, worked in factories and fields that demonstrated efficiency beyond their nation's reach. Each detail, each ordinary routine acted like a chisel, breaking apart the granite of Nazi myth. Slowly, painfully, they began to see what had been hidden from them their whole lives. That dignity, abundance, and freedom could exist, not in theory, but in the daily normality of a society that worked without terror. By the spring of 1944, the war had pulled so many American men into uniform that the United States faced shortages across farms and factories. The solution was pragmatic. German prisoners would be put to work under careful supervision. For the women at Fort Devens and later other camps, this meant passing beyond the barbed wire in guarded trucks each morning, traveling through landscapes that shocked them more deeply than any propaganda pamphlet or lecture ever could. The first trips to farms in Texas revealed machines that seemed almost otherworldly. Vast cotton fields shimmered under the sun, and towering combines rolled through them with mechanical precision. The women watched as a single machine devoured in one day what entire German villages could not have managed in a month. They stood suddenly, hands shielding their eyes as the massive steel teeth swept through endless rows, spitting cotton into great bins. One prisoner murmured that in Germany, women and children bent their backs for weeks to achieve a fraction of this harvest. Here, a farmer, his son, and a humming machine accomplished it with ease. In Iowa, the scale of American abundance widened even further. Trucks rattled along gravel roads, tractors plowed earth in neat symmetrical rows, and barns towered above fields that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The women stared in disbelief at ordinary families who owned not just one tractor, but often two, alongside cars and trucks that would have been luxuries in Germany. One farmer's teenage boy, no more than 16, drove a gleaming machine worth more than a German family might earn in a lifetime. He whistled as he worked, unconcerned, while his father spoke cheerfully with the guards. The casual possession of wealth, the effortless efficiency of labor, struck the prisoners with a force sharper than any battlefield defeat. The revelations continued at canning factories in California, where prisoners were assigned to assist with food preparation. Conveyor belts rattled endlessly, glass jars clicked into place, and machines sealed tins in great clattering bursts. Women who had once prided themselves on their efficiency as nurses, clerks, or factory assistants were stunned to see American women running entire lines with calm confidence. A single worker oversaw the operation of machines that processed more food in a day than a German plant could in weeks. The prisoners whispered to each other in awe, unable to comprehend how a nation at war could devote such resources to civilian abundance while also supplying its armies abroad. Yet what struck them most was not the machines, nor the scale of production, but the treatment they received from civilians. The women braced themselves for hostility when they first stepped onto American farms and into factories. They expected glares, insults, perhaps even spit on the ground where they walked. Instead, the opposite occurred. Farmers greeted them politely, sometimes even warmly. At noon, when the sun stood high and the work paused, many were invited to sit with the farm families for lunch. Sandwiches thick with meat and cheese were passed around. Fruit as bright as jewels was placed on the table, and bottles of milk were poured without hesitation. One prisoner later confessed in her diary, "The farmers' children ate like royalty. They gave us more food than our officers in Germany ever received. I could not understand why our enemies treated us this way." The kindness pierced deeper than abundance. To be fed generously by enemy civilians, to be welcomed into their homes, even briefly, shattered every expectation planted by years of indoctrination. They had been told Americans were cruel, selfish, and incapable of respect. Instead, they saw hospitality extended even to prisoners who had once worn the enemy's uniform. The shock left many uneasy, for it stripped away the shield of hatred that had made the war endurable. More disorienting still was the diversity of the workforce. On farms and in factories, the women saw African Americans and immigrants working alongside white Americans as equals. Black men operated combines. Mexican workers loaded trucks. Women of every background supervised production lines. There was laughter, casual talk, and camaraderie, all in direct contradiction to the racial hierarchy drilled into the prisoners since childhood. One woman whispered that she had been taught such people were incapable of skilled work. Yet here they ran machines that fed an entire nation. To see this with their own eyes struck at the very heart of Nazi ideology. Each day beyond the wire eroded another layer of certainty. The machines proved Germany's industrial myths hollow. The wealth of ordinary families exposed the falsehood of American poverty. The kindness of civilians undermined the idea of enemies defined by hatred. And the sight of diverse workers thriving together shattered the poisonous doctrines of racial superiority. At night, back in their barracks, the women whispered about what they had seen. Some clung to the hope that it was illusion, that the abundance would crumble, that the kindness was staged. But as days turned into weeks, the consistency of reality became undeniable. The sandwiches were always thick with meat. The milk was always fresh. The machines always ran smoothly. The workers always laughed together. In their hearts, something began to change. Fear remained and shame too, for they felt the betrayal of their former beliefs gnawing at them. But alongside it grew admiration and even longing. For in those glimpses of America beyond the wire, they saw not only abundance, but freedom, a society functioning without fear, where work was efficient not because of brutality, but because of confidence and cooperation. Many of the women began to realize with quiet desperation that they did not wish to return home. Germany meant ruins, hunger, and suspicion. America, even in captivity, meant warmth, food, dignity, and glimpses of a life lived without chains. The longing startled them, frightened them, but it was there nonetheless. Each day they passed beyond the wire. They carried back not only memories of abundance, but seeds of a truth that could not be unlearned. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the women who had once served Hitler began dreaming of staying in the land they had been taught to hate. By the middle of 1944, the work assignments and the constant encounters with American abundance had softened many of the prisoners' resistance. But what truly broke down the walls inside their minds came not from food or machinery, but from education. In Germany, books had been weapons controlled by censors and stamped with party approval. Questioning official doctrine and could mean denunciation, interrogation, even death. Most of the women had grown up under the Hitler Youth system, taught that obedience was virtue and doubt was treason. Yet in captivity, they discovered that ideas were treated not as threats, but as living things to be shared, argued, and tested. The first shock came with the libraries. Inside the camp, buildings stood shelves groaning under thousands of books. There were histories, novels, scientific journals, poetry collections, even works by authors whose names had been banned back home. A prisoner who had once risked arrest for secretly reading Thomas Mann found his novels stacked casually on a shelf beside Mark Twain and Dickens. The sight of so many ideas freely available made some women dizzy with excitement, others fearful, as though by touching the books they were breaking a taboo that had ruled their entire lives. Yet the guards and camp officials encouraged them to borrow as many as they wished. No one checked what they chose. No one punished them for what they read. Then came the newspapers. Each morning, stacks of American dailies arrived in the camp, papers from Boston, New York, and Chicago. The women opened them expecting propaganda, but what they found stunned them even more than the abundance of eggs and milk in the cafeteria. Editorials openly criticized President Roosevelt. Cartoonists mocked government officials. Debates raged in print about war policies, about race, about the economy. To minds trained under the Reich, where even whispering doubt could end in prison, the sight of a nation criticizing its own leaders in public was incomprehensible. One prisoner wrote in her diary, "If the Americans allow their newspapers to insult their president, yet their nation grows stronger every day. Perhaps freedom is not weakness, but strength." Soon professors began to arrive, universities eager to support what was quietly called the re-education programs and lecturers into the camps. Men who had taught at Harvard, Yale, and smaller colleges stood in front of women who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler and spoke about democracy, economics, and history. They explained how checks and balances worked, how parliaments functioned, how rights were protected by law rather than granted by leaders. The women listened with cautious curiosity, their faces betraying both skepticism and hunger. Some challenged the lecturers, insisting that democracy bred chaos, that Germany's order had been necessary. Instead of punishment, the professors welcomed the questions, turning them into debates. The women were astonished to be treated as thinking beings rather than empty vessels. For the first time in their lives, they were encouraged to argue, to doubt, and to form their own conclusions. Not all classes were theoretical. Many were practical, designed to prepare prisoners for a future beyond war. Nutrition and home economics became among the most popular. Women who had struggled to stretch thin rations back in Germany learned how to plan balanced meals, how to store food using refrigeration, and how to use ingredients with efficiency and variety. Demonstrations of modern cooking techniques filled them with both amazement and grief. Recipes called for oranges, bananas, chocolate, butter, and above all, eggs. These were items most had not seen in years, luxuries in Germany that only party elites could hope to obtain. Here they were treated as ordinary staples. When the American instructors whipped eggs into fluffy peaks or folded them into golden omelets, the women watched with almost reverent silence. Scrambled eggs, which had once stunned them in the cafeteria, now reappeared as a symbol not just of abundance, but of a system so productive that even prisoners could live as though shortages did not exist. As the classes continued, diaries began to shift in tone. No longer did they only describe meals, machinery, or the shock of American wealth. Now they recorded ideas. They copied passages from books, reflected on lectures, and questioned the slogans that had defined their youth. A woman who had been raised by a party of official father wrote, "They told us freedom made people weak, that too many voices would destroy unity. Yet I see here that freedom gives them strength. They criticize and they argue, but their factories produce. Their farms overflow, their armies advance. Perhaps unity through fear is not strength at all." The impact of these experiences reached beyond personal reflections. Around the camp tables, women began to whisper not just about the war, but about what might follow it. Could Germany be rebuilt without the cruelty, without the lies? Could a system based on democracy and abundance replace one based on conquest and fear? The very act of asking such questions marked a profound transformation. These were women who had once sworn themselves to a Reich that demanded obedience without thought. Now they were debating policies, imagining futures, and allowing themselves to hope for something different. The American authorities had not expected such openness. They had assumed the women would resist, that propaganda drilled into them for years could not be undone by lectures or libraries. Yet the reality of camp life, the daily evidence of freedom combined with the intellectual nourishment of books and classes, accomplished what no speech could. The women began to see not just the abundance of food and machines, but the abundance of thought. And in that abundance, they recognized a truth more devastating to Nazi ideology than any bomb. For many, the symbol of scrambled eggs lingered as a reminder. What had begun as a shocking breakfast of unexpected luxury became an emblem of something far larger. A society where efficiency created plenty, where freedom created strength, and where even prisoners could live with dignity. Through education, they not only questioned the lies they had been fed, but began actively imagining a new Germany that might one day stand not on fear, but on freedom. What unsettled the German women more than the electricity, the machinery, or even the food, was something far quieter, harder to measure, and infinitely more powerful. It was the kindness they encountered in captivity, a humanity that slipped past every wall of propaganda and entered their hearts before they could resist it. At first, they mistrusted it. When Red Cross volunteers appeared at the gates carrying boxes and parcels, the prisoners braced for lectures for stage theater meant to soften them into compliance. Instead, the packages contained candy wrapped in bright paper, thick socks knitted by unseen hands, and cards carefully written in childish script, signed by American school children who had been told to remember the enemy at Christmas. Some women opened the boxes in silence, convinced they would find hidden messages or poisoned goods. But there was nothing except sincerity, the small tokens of strangers who, instead of hatred, offered them care. The Christmas of 1944 became etched into memory as a turning point. At Fort Deans, the women were led into a hall where a choir sang carols in both English and German. Their voices rose in harmony on stilt, filling the barracks with a sound that made many prisoners weep openly. It was not propaganda. It was not staged. These were ordinary Americans who had lost husbands and brothers in the war. Yet they chose to extend grace to the very people who had helped fight against them. One woman whispered afterward, "We were told the Americans were merciless, but here they sang our songs. How can one continue to hate after such a gift? Other gestures cut even deeper. News circulated that American families, through church groups, were sending packages to German civilians still living under the shadow of bombs. To prisoners who had heard their families described shortages so dire that children went to bed hungry, the idea was unbelievable. How could a nation pouring bombs on their cities also send food and medicine to their civilians? Yet it was true. They saw it in letters. They heard it from guards. And eventually they read it in newspapers. One prisoner wrote in her diary, "They said they fought Hitler, not us. And I believed them because their actions proved it." Medical care became another revelation. In Germany, even soldiers often went without proper treatment while civilians begged for aspirin and doctors improvised with crude substitutes. At Fort Deans, when a woman collapsed with fever, she was carried to the infirmary and treated with the same urgency given to an American soldier. They were astonished to see penicillin administered freely, a medicine they had heard only as rumor whispered among doctors back home. In Germany, it was reserved for the elite, if it was available at all. Here, it was used even for enemy prisoners. Equally shocking was the presence of psychiatric care. In the Reich, weakness of mind was condemned, mocked, or punished. Depression, anxiety, or trauma were treated as moral failings, signs of impurity to be purged. Yet in America, women who showed signs of breakdown were not punished, but counseled. Some were given therapy sessions with doctors who spoke to them gently, encouraging them to speak of nightmares, losses, and fears. For the prisoners, this was inconceivable to be treated with such dignity while wearing the uniform of the enemy stripped away the last defenses of indoctrination. Every encounter layered contrast upon contrast. In Germany, loyalty had been demanded through fear, through cruelty, through the constant threat of punishment. In America, loyalty seemed to arise naturally, inspired not by force, but by compassion. It was a concept so alien that the women struggled to name it. They had been taught that sentimentality was weakness, that compassion was a flaw. Yet here, they saw it practiced by a people who were stronger than they had imagined, and who fought not with hatred, but with conviction in their own humanity. Whispers began to spread through the barracks at night. Women admitted to one another that they dreaded the thought of returning home. They had letters from family describing bombed-out neighborhoods, shortages so cruel that neighbors scavenged for potato peels in refuge heaps. They imagined trudging back into that devastation, carrying memories of scrambled eggs, hot showers, libraries of forbidden books, and now Christmas gifts from children who should have despised them. The contrast was unbearable. One prisoner whispered to her bunkmate, "If this is the enemy, then perhaps I do not wish to return to my friends." The thought frightened them, for to admit such a thing felt like betrayal. Yet the seed had been planted. Each act of compassion made Thaddeus grow. It was no longer unthinkable to imagine staying in America. For some, it became a quiet longing. They dreamed of farms in Iowa, of factories in California, of small towns where electricity lit every street. They dreamed of walking without fear, of speaking without censorship, of being treated as human beings rather than instruments of a state. The irony was bitter. They had come as prisoners, expecting humiliation, expecting to be broken. Instead, they discovered dignity, and it was this dignity extended so freely by the enemy that undid years of indoctrination more effectively than any battlefield defeat. In the quiet moments after Christmas, when the carol still echoed in their minds and the warmth of knitted socks clung to their feet, many of them admitted to themselves what they could not yet say aloud, that the life they'd glimpsed here was worth more than the life they had left behind. By the spring of 1945, the rumors had become impossible to ignore. The Allies were advancing on every front. Germany was collapsing, and word filtered into Fort Devens that the women would soon be sent home. Yet instead of joy, the news struck the barracks like a death sentence. For months, Letters from relatives had painted a picture darker than any nightmare. Cities lay in rubble. Food was scarce beyond imagining. And the collapse of order meant fear on every street. Home no longer meant the warmth of familiar walls or the embrace of loved ones. Home meant hunger, ruin, and uncertainty. America, even behind barbed wire, had given them something else entirely. Warmth, food, and the strange, intoxicating dignity of being treated as human beings. Whispers began in the dormitories, then grew louder until the guards themselves could hear the conversations. Women asked one another the same question in hesitant tones. What if we could stay? At first it seemed foolish, a dream too wild to consider. Yet within weeks, the idea hardened into petitions. Camp commanders began receiving carefully written letters from prisoners offering to remain in America, not as free citizens, but as laborers. Some promised they would work indefinitely on farms or in factories, asking only for food and shelter in return. Others wrote more daring requests, pleading for permission to marry American men they had come to know through work assignments or church groups, though regulations strictly forbade it. The desperation startled officials who had assumed all prisoners longed for home. Instead, they found themselves confronted by women begging not for freedom, but for the privilege of remaining captives in America. The testimonies that accompanied these requests were heartbreaking in their simplicity. One woman described the first morning she had tasted scrambled eggs, her hands trembling as she raised the fork to her lips. She confessed that she had wept, not because the food was extraordinary in flavor, but because it represented something she had never known: abundance without fear. Another wrote about her first hot shower, how she had stood beneath the spray for nearly half an hour, unable to move, convinced that the water would be cut off at any moment. She explained that in that moment she realized life could be lived with comfort rather than constant deprivation. A third prisoner wrote of the first book she read freely without fear of a Gestapo raid or denunciation. I turned the pages, she confessed, and I understood that knowledge need not be dangerous. It can be shared, debated, even laughed at. In that moment, I knew I'd lived my whole life in chains of the mind. For many, these small experiences became symbols far larger than the objects themselves. Scrambled eggs were no longer just a breakfast food. They were proof that a society could feed its people and even its prisoners with ease. Hot showers were no longer mere hygiene, but evidence that abundance could be a daily expectation rather than a rare indulgence. Books were not just paper and ink, but gateways to a world where thought was free and loyalty was earned, not demanded by fear. To the German women, these things had come to embody dignity itself, and the thought of returning to a land where such dignity did not exist filled them with despair. The camp officers, many of them hardened veterans of combat, were unprepared for the intensity of the pleas. One commander later recalled that he had expected hatred or resentment from the prisoners, not gratitude. Yet, day after day, women approached him with eyes full of tears, begging him to find a way for them to remain. Some promised they would live quietly, never causing trouble. Others offered to take the hardest labor, to till the fields or scrub the floors of hospitals. What struck him most was their sincerity. They were not bargaining for comfort. They were terrified of losing it. Around the same time, reports reached the camp of conditions in Germany that only deepened the women's desperation. Dresden had burned, Berlin was battered daily, and food shortages were pushing civilians to the brink of starvation. Letters smuggled in by the Red Cross described families boiling weeds for soup, children fainting from hunger in schools, mothers scavenging through ash heaps for scraps. Against this backdrop, the prisoners compared their own lives: full plates of food, warm clothes, access to books, music, and even kindness from strangers. The contrast was unbearable. One woman told a chaplain, "I know I should want to return to my homeland, but I cannot." Germany is no longer home. Home is where one is fed, clothed, and treated with respect. For me, that place is here. The symbolism of scrambled eggs returned again, and again in their words. What had once been a simple breakfast became the shorthand for everything they longed to keep. "If I return," one woman wrote in her petition, "there will be no eggs, no butter, no milk, no peace, only fear." The officers who read her words admitted privately that they could not forget them. For the prisoners, the idea of staying was not just longing, it was survival. They knew that repatriation meant returning to ruins where the Nazi regime had collapsed. But suspicion and hardship remained. Some feared reprisals for being captured. Others dreaded the hunger and disease that was spreading across Germany. But deeper still was the fear of losing what they had found in captivity: dignity, compassion, and the possibility of a life unchained from dictatorship. By the final months of the war, the petitions stacked higher on the commanders' desks, and though regulations made it impossible to grant them, their very existence testified to the transformation that had taken place. Women who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler now begged to remain in the land they had been taught to hate. They had arrived as enemies, but they now clung to America as a refuge. Their longing to stay was not born of weakness, but of revelation. They had seen what a free society looked like, and they could not bear to let it go. When the war finally ended in the spring of 1945, the orders for repatriation came swiftly. The women who had lived within the wire at Fort Devens packed their few belongings with heavy hearts, each step toward departure feeling like a slow betrayal of the life they had glimpsed. The trucks that had once carried them to farms and factories now carried them to ships bound east, back across the Atlantic to a Germany that was no longer the homeland they remembered, but a graveyard of broken cities and fractured hopes. They left behind warm barracks, steady meals, and the dignity of being treated as human beings. And they stepped into a world of ruin that smelled of ash and hunger. For many, the contrast was unbearable. Bombed-out neighborhoods gaped like empty skulls. Families were scattered or gone entirely, and the black market became the only guarantee of survival. The women spoke little at first of what they had seen in America, afraid their words would sound like treason to neighbors still clinging to bitterness. Yet in kitchens and churches around makeshift tables cobbled together from rubble, they began to share stories. They told of barracks warmed by the steam radiators, of hot water that flowed endlessly from showers, of libraries stacked with books that could be read without fear. They spoke of scrambled eggs, golden, plentiful, shared even with prisoners, and of Christmas packages sent by American children to enemy captives. In these retellings, the tone was never one of gloating, but of quiet testimony. They were not boasting of privilege, but showing that another way of life was possible. Historians would later call this influence subtle, yet powerful, a kind of underground current shaping post-war German society from within. The women had been witnesses to a democracy that functioned not through fear, but through debate, not through scarcity, but through abundance, not through cruelty, but through compassion. They carried those memories into their work as nurses, teachers, clerks, and mothers, and in small, steady ways they passed them on. The transformation revealed itself most clearly in the next generation. Children born into rubble grew up hearing stories not only of destruction, but of possibility. Mothers told them that they had seen electricity lighting every house in distant towns, that they had tasted meals without ration cards, that they had witnessed Americans criticize their president freely and still remain strong. They taught their children that dignity was not a weakness, but a strength, that compassion was not a flaw, but the bedrock of power. These quiet lessons, repeated across thousands of homes, helped prepare the soil for a democratic Germany to rise from the ashes. In time, reunions were organized, gatherings where former prisoners came together decades later to reflect on what those years had meant. By then, the bitterness of captivity had long since given way to gratitude for what they had learned. At one such meeting in the 1980s, a woman stood and summed up the experience with words that left the hall in silence. "We arrived as soldiers of Hitler. We left as witnesses of democracy. I begged to stay, but though I returned, America stayed with me forever. Around her, women nodded, tear-sown faces lined with age, each remembering their own first morning, their own shock, their own transformation. For them, the symbol never faded. Scrambled eggs remained the shorthand for everything that had changed their lives. It was not the taste itself, though they could recall it with perfect clarity. The butter melting into soft folds, the richness compared to watery turnip stew. It was what the eggs represented. A society so abundant it could feed its prisoners better than their own nation fed its soldiers. Society so confident it could treat its enemies with dignity instead of contempt. That meal at the long cafeteria tables of Fort Devens became in memory the beginning of liberation, not of bodies, but of minds. Looking back, the women understood that America had won more than battles with tanks and planes. It had won a deeper war, one fought with hot showers, with electric lights, with kindness at Christmas, and with scrambled eggs served without malice. They had come expecting humiliation, expecting to be broken. Instead, they had been shown a vision of freedom so ordinary, so natural to their captives, that it dismantled everything they had believed. As the decades passed and Germany rebuilt itself into a democratic nation, many of these former prisoners recognized that their memories had played a part in that rebirth. They had carried home not just stories of defeat, but seeds of possibility. And when they told their children, I saw another way. They were not only remembering, they were planting. The story closes where it began at the breakfast table on that first morning in America. Hungry, frightened women filed into a cafeteria, expecting humiliation, expecting rations so thin they could barely be called food. Instead, they found trays piled high with scrambled eggs, warm bread, butter, fruit, and coffee. They tasted and they wept, for in that moment they knew they had been lied to their entire lives. It was the simplest of meals, yet it carried the most devastating truth. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but the quiet abundance of a free society.